And just want to remind those of you in the gallery to turn your phones on silent, please. So do that. And then for those of you watching at home, we are at Peep Space in Tarrytown, New York, which is an artist-run space that is owned and directed by Monica Carrier. My name is Iris Jaffe, and this panel is organized for the exhibition Brain Candy, which I curated and which features artwork by 12 artists: Monica Carrier, Steph Costello, Leslie Friedman, Paul Gagner, who's on the panel today, myself, Jane Kane Lawrence, who was also a co-founder of Peep Space, Jenny Kemp, Victoria Laura Miller, Shae Nadine, SubtleFlux, who is also on the panel today, Cheryl Oppenheim, Antonia Perez, and Melissa Staker. Very quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the artists for allowing me to show your work in this context. Brain Candy was actually inspired by my own experience of healing from PTSD and a systemic bacterial infection that wound up impairing my physical health and brain chemistry. I noticed that when I allowed myself to make and create art, I experienced less of the problematic symptoms that I developed after having PTSD and later on after having this infection, and I felt much better overall. This experience, coupled with news articles that I had read, which cited the neurochemical benefits of seeing and making art, are what inspired Brain Candy, which is a phrase I kept thinking about while looking at Melissa Staker's paintings, which are in the front of the gallery. They're the very colorful pieces in the front, and I thought of her work as being brain candy because it just makes my brain so happy to look at her work. So all of the works in Brain Candy are colorful, vibrant, joyful, and humorous because I wanted to emphasize the positive feelings that artwork can often induce in us. Today, our special guest panel is a neuroscientist named Ed Vessel, who specializes in neuroaesthetics, or what I will quickly describe here as the scientific study of how art affects the human brain, body, and behavior, but I will let Ed give you a better definition of this in his presentation. And Ed is a cognitive and computational neuroscientist with a focus on visual, aesthetic valuation, liking, creativity, and curiosity. He received his bachelor's from Johns Hopkins and a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Southern California. He was recently appointed as the Eugene Surowitz Assistant Professor at City College of New York and the CUNY Graduate Center's Department of Psychology. He is the creator of the newly launched Visual Neuroaesthetics VISNA Lab at City College. Prior to his appointment at City College, Ed was a senior research scientist in the Department of Neuroscience at the prestigious Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, MPIEA, in Frankfurt, Germany. Prior to his work in Germany, Ed was also a research scientist at NYU Center for Brain Imaging, where he also did his postdoctoral research. He is presently on the board of directors of the International Association for Empirical Aesthetics and is a much sought after speaker on the topic. We are so grateful and honored to welcome you today as our expert in the field of neuroaesthetics. Our other special guests are two artists from the exhibition Brain Candy, Shae Nadine, SubtleFlux, and Paul Gagner, who I will let introduce themselves shortly and their work, before Ed gives some more background information on his research and gives a short presentation on neuroaesthetics. To quickly give you some background on myself, I'm a New York-based artist who makes colorful, often funny work that remixes art history. Several years ago, I wrote an article called The Anti-Artist Statement in Hyperallergic that went viral on the internet. In the past, I've worked for the gallerist Ron Feldman and the artist Tom Sachs, and I studied art history and visual art at Brown University. My piece in this exhibition is a collage-inspired painting called Springtime that remixes a number of iconic pieces of modern art. And I'll let Shae go ahead and introduce herself and her work.
I'm Shae, and my piece is sitting behind its model, clay. And they are prints that were taken from a 3D model of the human brain. And I believe that there's correlation between nature and humanity, and wherever I see those parallels, I look to illustrate them in various ways. So that particular piece, the silicate forms that are used in the printing become an aspect that is sort of like the buildings we built into the mountains. And so it's called terraforming in that sense. It's sort of splitting between the human brain and the function of the earth. And that's generally my thing. Oh.
Great. Thanks for having us. My name's Paul Gagner, and I'm primarily a painter and a sculptor. This large thank you painting is one of mine, and then the one across from it with his cell phone and the moon is another piece that I have in the show. And I would say that I primarily deal with the anxieties that artists have you know, they're making, creating art, and then like exploring like tropes of being an artist. So yeah, I think that's probably, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, so Ed, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I want to thank Monica and for putting together the show, and for all of you for being here with me. I've been asked to give you a brief presentation to give you a little bit of information about exactly what neuroaesthetics is. And as a, no worries, as a scientist, true to form, I'm gonna use some slides to do so, but I promise that there's not too many. I run a lab called the Visual Neuroaesthetics Lab, and we've as was mentioned, I'm kind of getting things going here at City College. Recently moved back from Germany, and I guess Iris asked me to give a definition of what neuroaesthetics is. In general, it's the neuroscience of aesthetic experiences. So trying to understand what happens in the brain and what are the psychological and neural bases when a person finds a piece of artwork to be moving or beautiful, or when you look at a sunset and are inspired and find that painting, that sunset to be beautiful, when you engage with music and music moves you. So I think, and one thing I want to make clear there is that I'm interested in understanding how pieces of art specifically impact us, but not just art, because clearly we can have aesthetic experiences with things that exist in the world more naturally. And it's a real question, what's different about the ways we engage with something which is art versus something which is not? Is there really something different in the way that we engage with those different types of objects? Okay, so a big question that really guides a lot of my work is this one here I've got on the screen. The screen is showing? Okay, good. Which is how much of aesthetics is in the world versus in the head. So when you find something to be beautiful, how much of that sense of beauty can be attributed to the features of a sunset or to the features of a specific artwork, and how much of it really can only be understood if we understand something about you as the viewer and something about your history, your background. And you know, spoiler alert, I guess I firmly come down on the side that you need to know something about the perceiver, that you cannot explain what is beautiful in the world simply by looking at the stimulus itself, by looking at the piece of artwork or by looking at the sunset. You really need to understand something about the experience that the viewer has had. Where did they grow up? How do they understand the world around them? What kind of things that they've been exposed to? What kinds of things are they an expert in? Because these really color the way that we interpret the objects we encounter in the world, whether or not they are a face or a landscape or a building or a painting. So one of the ways that we do that is we measure something called shared taste. And the idea here is if I were to take all of you in this room and I were to ask you to rate the paintings on the walls, I might get a set of numbers from each of you, and then I could ask, do we agree? Do we all agree that this one is the best, or this one is the second best, or this one is the worst? And so by doing that, we can measure the degree to which different people share similar tastes. And why is this important? Well, because if it were the case that our aesthetic experiences were driven solely by the features of the world, then we should all agree. If it's the case that I could create a formula that says this much green plus this much symmetry plus this much of whatever equals an aesthetically beautiful painting, then the person shouldn't matter. We should all have the exact same reactions to different paintings. But if it's the case that different people don't agree, that one person might find this one resonates with them the best, but somebody else really resonates with a different painting, then clearly we need to understand something about what's different from person to person, something about their subjective experience and the way that they're processing these different items. And what I'm showing here is data from one experiment where in the more saturated, darker colors, you can see how much of kind of the variance, how much of the data in an experiment can be explained by a shared factor. And so if you start on the left, you can see that when you ask people to make attractiveness judgments of faces, there's a really strong shared component. That means that if I ask one person to make a set of ratings of faces, I can use their ratings to predict somebody else very well. But as you start moving to the right, as you start looking at how people relate to architecture or how people relate to art, you see that there's a vanishingly small amount of shared taste. To say it another way, people really differ in which particular artworks they find to be aesthetically appealing. And so there's a lot to explain in terms of how it is that different people's backgrounds lead to these vastly different interpretations of something like a piece of artwork or a building. A second way that I look at this relationship, this dynamic between the external world and your internal subjective mental states is by looking at the brain systems that are either externally focused or brain systems that are internally focused. So if you think about the visual system or your auditory system, these are brain networks that are really focused on the external world, on understanding what's out there, what am I looking at, what's the structure of the world around me. But there's also a brain network, which here I've indicated in yellow, it's called the default mode network. And this brain system is a brain system that is really inwardly directed. It's a brain system that supports internally directed thought. So when you are thinking about what you want to do tomorrow, when you're planning what you might do, where you might go for dinner, or when you're just kind of thinking internally, when you're mind wandering, if you're not listening to me and kind of like lost in your own thoughts, your DMN is very active. And so we've really, in a lot of our work, been looking at the relationship between these two brain networks. And we find, surprisingly, that when I show you, when that happens, your auditory system is active, and the default mode network is actually turned off. It's actually suppressed. Right? You're externally focused. You're focused out there in the world. We find that when I show you a piece of artwork that you find aesthetically moving, when something that really grabs you, not only is your externally focused visual system active, but this internally focused default mode network is also engaged. And that's very interesting because it's really different from how your brain is typically operating. Either, under most circumstances, you're either focused out in the world or you're focused internally. But moments when you are strongly aesthetically moved seem to change those brain network dynamics and create a different mental state that we can measure. Okay. Now, in some of my recent work, we've been trying to go beyond a statement that not everyone's experience is the same, and really try to decompose that and understand what are the internal states and mechanisms that really drive us to have individual subjective experiences. And in my last slide, I'm just going to highlight two of those. So the first one is what I call pleasure from understanding. And really the idea here is that our brain has a fundamental mechanism that gives us pleasure when we have an aha moment, when we make sense of something. And this is separate from other ways we can get pleasure, right? We can get pleasure from associations, that we know that we're going to get money or we're going to get food when we go to a certain place, or that certain situations or certain experiences are likely to lead to positive outcomes. But we can also get pleasure just by understanding something, even if we have no previous exposure to it. And so this idea that we can have aha experiences of sense-making, of trying to kind of grok something, of wrap our head around something, and that can give us pleasure, I think is a real critical component of what happens when we engage with a piece of art, when we try to make sense of it, and we have sometimes a really transformative or moving experience because of that. A second piece of my recent work has focused on this idea of self-relevance. And the idea here, it relates to the first one. The idea here is that when a piece of art relates to something from your own life, that your own structured knowledge about your past, about your experience, can act as a map. It can act as a key or a map, a roadmap for you to go deeper and get more information from that experience. And of course, sometimes when we engage with art, we're engaging with art to learn about other. We're engaging with art to learn about somebody else's experience. But I think the point here is that when an artist is able to take their experience and encapsulate it in a format where you can find touch points with it, where you can find a way into it, where it relates to something about your own personal experience, then you can go deeper. You can get something not just from its visual form, but also from the conceptual knowledge, or from the conceptual form of that piece. And that enables you to have a greater aha experience, get more from it, and you find it more aesthetically appealing. So those are just kind of like two small examples of some of the ways that we've been trying to understand the neuroscience of what happens when you find a piece of artwork aesthetically moving or engage with art. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is, what I've talked about here is really our attempts to understand these moments when you find something really aesthetically moving and appealing. But of course, that's only one of many questions you might ask about an experience with art or an experience with nature. And there are other researchers in this field who are interested in asking a lot of those other questions as well. So that's it.
Great, thank you. So for the panel discussion, let's start with a question for Ed. How does neuroscience define art? Is this different from the definition of art that we have in the dictionary? What about making and seeing art is different from other activities that one might do? And then also, what regions of the brain are involved in making and seeing art, and how does art affect these regions differently than other activities?
I might leave the last part of that question so I'm not talking to you for like 20 minutes. So I guess, in terms of a definition of art, I think that, first of all, it's important for any domain of inquiry to understand the boundaries of what it can answer. And I think that it's actually would be tricky, if not impossible, for me as a neuroscientist to try to define what art is. I'm not interested in using brain imaging or psychology to try to answer what is art and what is not. So to some degree, I'm really dependent upon you. I'm dependent upon artists or the public to tell me what they think is art. And I think that when we do experiments, we have to grab something about the canonical experience that people have when they're having an artistic experience, and we're trying to understand that, but with an understanding that the borders are fuzzy. And so what I will say is that I think that from a psychological perspective, what matters is when we think something is art. So when we're told something is art, when we're in a setting where something on the wall is clearly meant to be art. I walk in here and I know that the things on the wall are intended to be art. But for example, let's say I see a pile of stones in the forest. I could think that just happened randomly, and I could admire it as a pile of stones in the forest. Or if someone tells me, like, oh, I built that, or if you take the same pile of stones and you put it on a pedestal in a gallery, now I'm wrapping it in a frame where I'm being told that it is art. And I think that is important, because what it does is we now engage with the same object as an intentional communication created by another person. And so we're bringing our language, our communication brain to bear, the part of our brain that we use to figure out other people's intentions. And so we look at that object and we're saying, okay, it's not just an object, but it was created in an intentional way. It was at least framed or chosen in an intentional way. And of course, with artwork, we can never really, as a viewer, it's a weird form of communication, because an artist might create something, and I might look at it, and I might try to get a message from it, and the message I get from it might not be the same message that the artist intended, but I might get some message from it. So it's this weird form of imperfect one-way communication. Only in some art forms you do get two-way communication, but in visual art, often it's kind of one way. And so I think that the important thing here is that we are bringing the same brain and the same brain processes to bear when we analyze, when we look at a face, or when we look at a landscape, or when we look at a piece of art or a building. But when we think something is art, we're also additionally bringing these communicative, intentional, empathic parts of the brain to bear on our interpretation, because we see it as a communication by another person, and we're trying to figure out what they meant.
Okay, and then my next question is for the artists. So what inspired you to become an artist to begin with, and what sort of artwork are you inspired to make, and do you have any ideas about why this is?
I can go first. Some questions. I don't know. I guess probably like a lot of artists, I started off quite young, and I think at first it was capturing and like reproducing, things that I just really liked, So I grew up in a rural area, so there was no art museums or galleries, so there was a lot of looking at comic books and looking at. I really loved Bloom County, the cartoon, and so it was a lot of like taking that and like reproducing it and then like adding to it, changing it, and I guess I was always told by family members like, oh, you want to be an artist, right? And like, yes, I do, and and I just didn't think much about it, and then I grew up and was like, oh, I'm pretty good at that. I'll do that, So not the most inspirational sort of back story to that, but what was the second part about?
What sort of artwork are you inspired to make, and do you have any ideas about why that is?
Yeah, well, I've always looked at the world in a, I guess, humorous way. Like I really like seeing humor and in irony, or things like out of place or whatever. It's just the way I've always looked at things. So my goal has always been to make people laugh, and so I really like it when people look at my paintings or my sculptures and get a chuckle. It's very satisfying. And why is that? I don't know. Everything I've been attracted to has been, like one of my favorite things was Bloom County growing up, and then one of my most memorable experiences was seeing Weird Al Yankovic live at the age of 7, and I'll never forget it. And I love that. And then I grew into loving, Frank Zappa and other humorous, sort of art forms or whatever. And it just brings me a lot of pleasure seeing people laugh. So.
Would you say that you make things that you find funny and that you hope other people will find funny, or do you?
Well, I guess the specific things that I focus on are, like the artist sort of, common things that I think that artists share, like anxieties about making things, the anxieties of the creative process, looking at serious things and trying to be funny about it, like looking at death and like, trying to make things that I think maybe aren't inherently funny and trying to laugh at them as a way of maybe a coping mechanism, or a way of better understanding myself. And I don't know, I guess I had always been told that like good art is like sharing yourself, it's like exposing, things that were maybe not easy to discuss, maybe trauma, or maybe, I think it helps to connect with people, I mean, you mentioned PTSD, there could be something, pleasurable about sharing and having that, somebody acknowledge that and say, I too feel that, and I think there's a lot of that, with my own anxieties, sharing it with others and hearing them say, I do have anxieties, and it's it helps with coping, helps with connecting.
Shae?
Passing the torch. So I've always been an artist. I don't think that was an option. I think that's just what I've always done from kind of day one. Whatever the medium, whatever the mode, whether it was through dance or music or making, I was selling jewelry at like grade 3 or something. So like whatever it was, I wanted to be doing. And I think I still take that facile perspective when I'm dealing with my work now. So I'm truly interdisciplinary. I'm working in all different modes and mediums. And I'm also using art as a conveyance tool. So for me, I take images from science. I do a lot of microscopy work. Obviously, these are human brain that are taken from an MRI. And I'm taking that beauty and then I'm twisting it and then I'm showing it to people to call attention to other things. So it's sort of like the way that I look at an organism under the microscope. if I make a tiny thing gigantic, and now you see this tiny thing gigantic as a projection, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, that's really beautiful. Then you find out it's a single-celled organism. You're like, wow, that's like something I can't even see. And it starts to change how you think about environment. It starts to change how you think about the scummy water next to your plant. And like maybe there is a whole host of little critters that live in there, but we don't even realize it. Or I think one of the favorite things that I filmed recently were these vinegar eels. They live in your kombucha. But under a microscope, they're these like really wild little eels, and I want to set them to music like a little ballet because they're just so cool. But like I get to see it, so I look at how can I convey that out to the world. So for me, being a highly research-based practice and then using art as a conveyance tool through beauty to create connection. So coming back to what you were saying, Ed, which is art as a modus for connecting and connection and sharing things. And then I think for me, titles, and I call it a thing ingredient list, but it's technically your materials. I feel like that's also a conveyance tool because it's the one space where an artist gets to share a little more about the work.
And then I have a question for you. Do you like, because I know that some of your work is a bit abstracted, right? So do you like when people don't know what it is at first and then you get to tell them later? Or do you give them that information up front, or like what sort of, I guess, how do you want the viewer to engage with your work?
So I think it depends on the vein. So if it's a microscopic image that hasn't been abstracted too much or is really in its form, then I like to share the information about what the organism is and what its place is on the planet and how long it's been here. So like an anemone, you look at it and you're like, well, we have like Cambrian fossils of anemones. That sort of says, wow, if they're dying off now and it's because of us and they've been here for that long, maybe it was us. Maybe we were the thing that changed something. So I think in that sense, yes. In the things that are drawings that are kind of inspired by the way I see the natural world, I think that there's space for people to interpret them as whatever it is that they see in them. I think Clay was saying the other day, he was like, that one looks very flora, and I feel like they're more fauna, and I was like, okay, I don't think of it as either. So I feel like that's sometimes the viewer's interpretation.
And I think it was interesting that Ed said that there are two ways of looking at art, like the artist's intention and then what the viewer perceives. And there's this well-known article by Marcel Duchamp, who was one of, I guess, the first conceptual artists. And he wrote this article called The Creative Act, and he said that basically the viewer completes the work, that the artist can't be fully aware of their intentions. And I really do find that to be true, because I think that there is a certain part of my subconscious that's involved in making art. Like, I don't fully understand my work myself. And I do feel like sometimes other people might understand it more than I do. You know, I'm drawn to something, I don't know why. I usually make art about things that are curious to me, that I don't fully understand. And so I'm glad when people bring new meaning to my work that I didn't see, that I didn't know. I find that really rewarding. I love that. And yeah, I totally relate to what you said. So, yeah. All right, so going on. For the artists, is the artwork that you enjoy seeing similar to the artwork that you make, or different, and why do you think this is?
I don't know. I think I'd like a whole host of different art. I love Duchamp. I don't think I share much of anything in common with him. And you know, I think it goes across the board: music, you know, visual art, whatever. I'm not entirely sure I understand what draws me to certain things. So there's definitely a lot of art that probably might be in the same vein as what I do that I do enjoy. But then there's lots of, you know, yeah, conceptual art, very dry, very like quiet, very whatever stuff that I don't do that I also like to I'm not sure that I could explain why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Shae?
I mean, I think I'm drawn to all different works for different reasons. We were talking about this on the way up. Like, I think things that are informed by my understanding of art history, I could really like a room full of Rubens where I like trip over myself as I'm walking through it because they're so extraordinary. But do I like what I would never want that in my home. But I really appreciate the history behind it, and I appreciate how it was painted, and I appreciate the scale of the pieces and the work that went into them. But from a taste standpoint, like, I don't think I wouldn't want to hang it in my apartment. I wouldn't want to look at it every day. So I find that there's a difference for me between what I appreciate because of my understanding of it, and then what I enjoy just by looking at it, like aesthetically, or I find that you're challenging something in my curiosity, like in Paul's piece, you know, it's speaking about plastic, as is the piece here, and it's like, so I'm drawn to things that are talking about things that I'm interested in, which is environment and single-use things, and bringing attention to those things. So I think there's an aspect of that, and then probably also just an aspect of, you know, to the point of the title of the show, right? Brain candy. It's just like, I look at it and it makes me happy. Like, your piece is just like, it makes you happy. Like, how can you happy? The little bird that's like about to land on its head. It's like, you know, it's just like you look at it and it makes you smile. Or Victoria's piece also, like, I look at it and I love the irony that she's created, and I like it for that. Where she has candy that has THC and candy that is for a kid. And those they look very similar, but yet they're very different. So I appreciate the conceptual behind a lot of pieces too, like you were saying. Yeah.
And then going back to Ed, why are certain people drawn to abstraction while others seem to be more drawn to representational work? And I've also read that certain people will have an emotional experience in front of abstract art, like a Rothko, while other people just don't have that sort of emotional response. And what does neuroscience tell us about these differences?
Yeah. So, just first, I just want to, as a side note, kind of mention, I think one thing that's been studied a fair amount in neuroscience more recently is the fact that especially across different forms of art, art can serve a lot of different functions. I think this kind of like speaks to, you know, when you might have something in your home versus when you might go out and look for something, or something that's really confronting to you. Confronting art can obviously be very impactful, but you don't necessarily want to have something extremely confronting hanging over your dining room table or something like that. The way that I'm going to kind of interpret your question is really one about individual differences. So why do different people like such different things? And it is very much the case that we see that some people are more tolerant of kind of the ambiguity that you might see in an abstract piece, whereas other people perhaps have a lower tolerance for ambiguity, and they might prefer or gravitate towards things that have a bit more representation in them. And so I think there are some personality differences, but even moving past the personality differences, for me, I think a real key is that art has this ability to speak to us depending upon our lived experience. So if we've had a particular experience in our past, some piece of artwork might really resonate with that. So I think Shae, your point that you're really drawn to things that kind of like resonate with your environmental messages, or with your, you know, that those types of things really grab you, and you gravitate towards those. I think that's really a key here. And so I think that, you know, more recently, myself and others in this field are really trying to think about, you know, if it's not the case that your reaction to a piece of artwork is kind of a formulaic paint by numbers determined by the artwork itself, what is determining that? And you know, we're kind of moving towards this idea that it's about what is your edge of learning? What is your bleeding edge, right? What do you know? What are you primed to know? What are you primed to learn? So if you are an expert in some field, you might have some information that allows you to go further and understand new things in that field. And so you can have aha moments with artwork that kind of like really speak to you and relate to your expert knowledge, whereas another person looking at the same piece might not get anything from it. Kind of as an analogy, you might think about if I were to tell you a joke in a language you don't know, you might find the the sounds of the language to be interesting or beautiful, but the impact of that joke is not mediated by the meaning of the joke. But if you then were to take a class in that language, if I came back with the same joke a semester later, you might get kind of the basic level of knowledge, like, oh, the basic punchline. Oh, okay, haha, I get it. But then if you go and you live in the culture for a few years, now you might start to understand the double entendres, the triple entendres, the multiple levels of meaning, and it might have a very different impact for you. So I think the same is true when we are looking at artwork. So, and I think that's one reason why abstract art is sometimes difficult for people who don't have as much art exposure, because they're looking for something a bit more representational that they can relate to, whereas someone who has a bit more experience with art more generally, they might have a sense for how that piece of abstract art fits into the panoply of art history, what it is that an artist might be working with, what techniques they're working with, like, oh, they're working with something about light, or they're working with something about the materials, and they might be more willing to kind of like hold space for like, what does this piece of artwork have to teach me, as opposed to an experience with an artwork where the message is really upfront and easily accessible to anyone that doesn't necessarily have more exposure or experience.
And I'm just going to go back to a quote that we had discussed earlier, and a writer named Jacob Devaney is quoted as saying, "When you observe a profound piece of art, you are particularly fired with the same neurons as the artist did when they created it, thus making new neural pathways and stimulating a state of inspiration. This sense of being drawn into a painting is called embodied cognition." And can you elaborate on that for us? And like, you had mentioned before that it is stronger when someone's an expert, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would take this statement metaphorically as being interesting and perhaps telling. I think I would be cautious about over-interpreting the statement literally. And so I think there's two pieces here. One piece is that when an artist is creating, you could think about their creative process as perhaps starting with a problem, or starting with a question, or starting with a concept. And of course, a lot of artists are starting from different places, right? One artist might be playing with some new medium that they started working with, and they're working on a problem about what can they do with this type of gel or with this type of photography paper or whatever. And so they're working on this conceptual problem, or somebody else might be working on some, they might be thinking about the prevalence of, media and cell phones, and how does that mediate our existence of the world. And so they're thinking about different things. So they're starting with a concept, and then they are from that concept, using, of course, their training and their artistic skill to try to put something on a canvas or in some other form that can really convey some kind of experience or be experiential for a viewer. And then the viewer is kind of doing that in reverse, right? So the viewer is starting with the perceptual experience. And of course, it's not an exact mirror because the artistic process is very iterative. But the viewing process is also iterative. We might try to make sense of something, and then we might bring some of our own thoughts to bear and change how we interpret that piece. And eventually, we might get to a deeper meaning. And again, that meaning may not match what the artist actually intended. But I think there's some theories out there that the rough time course or the rough kind of path of creation might in some way be a bit of a mirror of reception of art. I think that then the piece about embodied cognition is a little bit separate. So the idea of embodied cognition has been around in neuroscience for a long time. It has many implications that have nothing to do with art at all. But the basic idea is that the way that our brain processes information is not divorced from our body. And let me make that more specific, which is that, so for example, when I have a visual image in my head, the format and nature of that visual image is informed by the shape of my visual system and informed by the types of colors and shapes that my eyeballs are able to see. Or when I plan an action, the action that I plan is informed by the shape of my own body. right? If I have an injury, I'm not going to plan an action that uses that arm. Or if I'm a very short person or a very tall person, the way I might navigate a set of rocks to cross a stream is very different. So clearly, the types of cognitions that we generate are informed by the shape of our body. So that's kind of like level 1.0 of embodied cognition, this idea that our brain is, in the shape of the computations our brain does are informed by the physical form we inhabit. I think that there's some people who want to push the idea of embodied cognition a bit further to actually state that computation involves the body. So for example, when you walk into a room and something arousing happens, that you interpret that event depending upon how you feel. Like if you already have tension in your body, you've had a bad day, then maybe you interpret that event negatively, whereas the exact same event might be interpreted more positively if you didn't have tension in your body. And that is true, but I think that sometimes people claim or think about this idea that maybe actually the body is involved in information processing. And that's a line that I personally would not cross. I don't think that's true. I think that what is the case is that our brain gets information from our body. Our brain has information about how we feel. Our brain has information about whether we have tension in our muscles. Our brain has information about whether or not I'm hungry. But it's in the brain that information about our body state is combined to help us make decisions or make plans. So that's, like embodied cognition more generally. The last thing I'll say is there are some specific cases of artwork where people have employed embodied cognition as a causal explanation for how we might get meaning from those artworks. And that is particularly the case in artworks that involve some type of movement or involve the body. So for example, you can imagine a painting that has cuts in the canvas, where when you see it, you can almost, your interpretation of the meaning almost brings to mind yourself making that same action. Or when you watch a dance performance, we know that a person who is an expert dancer interprets that dance performance very differently because they have embodied knowledge of how difficult it is to perform those movements. So their interpretation of the difficulty and aesthetic meaningfulness of that act is very different from somebody who doesn't have that same expertise.
And then the next
I'm
question
sorry to
is,
interrupt. I just want to let you know we're just over about 40.
we're just over 40. Okay, I might ask one more quick question to the artists, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. So for the artists, this is a slightly related question to the embodied cognition question. It's about empathy. And do you find that seeing and making art makes you more or less empathetic, and why do you think this is? And then a question for Ed, how does neuroscience see the relationship between art and empathy, and are art and empathy related in any way from a structural or neurochemical standpoint?
Yeah, I would think so. I guess I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, this painting, for instance, my intention with it was to, thank the viewer, for taking time to look at it. That was strictly why I painted it, and in doing it, you learn other things about it, but there is I don't know, sure, I have, I want people to look at it. I have empathy for the viewer, yeah, I guess I'm not really sure if it was always there, and it's like been discovered or intensified because of that debating. I'm not entirely sure. I think I'm probably just naturally a more empathetic person, or I don't know, not more, but like I think I'm already have a lot of empathy. So yeah.
From elsewhere in your life.
I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure that I can separate the two.
Yeah.
I think art is a practice, and any practice that you engage in for extended periods of time has a level of, empathy to it, but I don't see the connection that deeply between the two. I think for me, my practice of empathy comes from my meditation practice. It comes from my experience of the world. It comes from how I relate to people. And it comes from generally being a more open person. So I think for some artists, I think it's the opposite. I think a lot of artists are very closed and are much like scientists or in their own little bubble, and they don't relate. So their art can be a way of sending messages or sharing information, sharing a shared experience, I would say. But I don't find the correlation as strong between the two. I think that the experience of bearing witness to something that might be difficult in art could create a level of empathy. So if I were to look at images of things that are very difficult, like there's a lot of photographers who document sort of rape type images and stuff like that, I think there's these sort of darker spaces you can go into that to force you into empathy. But I think that tends to be a little bit more either representational or just works that you can really feel the emotion coming through them.
That's really interesting. Actually, before I answer your question, I think one thing that in kind of the philosophy of aesthetics and empirical aesthetics in particular, that comes up a lot is this idea of aesthetic distance. That again, when you call something art or when you are experiencing something in an artistic context, you can disconnect the typical kind of automatic body emotional responses that might occur to an event. So for example, if you go to a horror film in a movie theater, you aren't necessarily running out of the theater when somebody comes at you with a knife because you know that it's art. And so I think this is also one reason why people are really interested in looking at art as a form of, its potential use in an art therapeutic context, that it would be a way for somebody to approach a difficult event, for example, like a traumatic experience, yet hopefully see it through a different interpretive lens, or kind of like remove some of that immediate body response that we might have. So I think that's really just a kind of a side thing that's very interesting. I'll just kind of try to quickly touch on the point about empathy. So from social neuroscience, we know a fair amount about what structures in the brain are engaged when we think about other people or when we reason about other people. So this is kind of the idea of empathy is related to a concept called theory of mind, that when we interact with another person, we assume they also have a mind like we do. Some of the brain structures that are involved in this are actually heavily overlapping with the default mode network, this brain system that I mentioned to you that we see engaged when people are engaging with artwork. And I think within social neuroscience, there's a lack of clarity still on exactly what parts of this system are engaged when we're thinking about ourselves versus we're thinking about others. And part of the problem there is that, again, the best way we can have a model of somebody else is to think about kind of ourselves. So we use our own self and processing as a model for other people. And I think that is part of what's going on when we see that the default mode network is engaged when people are engaging with artwork, which is that they're relating their own experience and looking at things as a communicative act, and then they're kind of like trying to kind of reach across that divide and have an experience of other and connect with other through their own interpretations and their own actions and their own kind of self-experiences.
So you're sort of like embodying the emotions of the other person.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are engaging this system in the brain that we have for simulating other people, and the way that we simulate other people is we start with ourselves first as the best model we have for other people.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Hey,
That
Iris.
makes sense.
Anybody with a Subaru JDF, you gotta move your car. JDS.
No,
Sorry. I've worked there for 4 years.
We just got the call about part 2 plate, that's why I'm here. That's
Oh.
the only reason.
we're so sorry.
Sorry to bother you guys.
So our time is just about up for the panel discussion, and now we're going to open up the questions to the audience for Ed and for the panelists. So does anyone have questions that they'd like to ask? Okay, let's go with the person that is most in the back. No, you. Sorry, you're seated. You're seated. You're right in front of the woman with the blue shirt.
Okay, so
That's you. Yeah.
okay. All right, now we've got that settled. So I have so many questions, but I'll try and get And in terms of how you're getting the data about aesthetics in the brain, is the technique you're using, are you using fMRI, or are there other approaches as well?
Yeah, we do a variety of things. So before we do any type of brain imaging, we do a lot of behavioral studies because we want to make sure that we have an experimental paradigm that can isolate the effect we care about. Because no matter what you read in the newspaper, we don't know enough about the brain yet to, in almost any domain, to just look at a brain pattern and know what that means. So we're still very much in the phase where we need to really understand something at a behavioral level, at a cognitive, first, before we then go and look at the brain. And then the brain techniques, imaging techniques that I'm using are primarily functional magnetic resonance imaging. So that's similar to like if you go to get an MRI on your arm, we use a technique that allows us to see a correlate neural activity. We're also using more EEG, electroencephalography, which is measuring basically electrical currents on the scalp that are generated from brain activity. And more recently, we've been doing some work with a technique called FNIRS, which stands for near infrared spectroscopy. And so there you actually are shining light into the skull, and then it is reflecting back, and the color of the light that reflects back reflects how much oxygen there is in that part of the brain, which is again a correlate of neural activity.
Yeah.
And so it's not as spatially precise, but the good thing about it is that unlike sticking someone in an MRI tube, like in a hospital, this is something you could wear on a head as somebody is walking around a museum or sitting in a performance space. So we're really just getting started with that. So, and then the last technique we use is a lot of computational methods. So we're using a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence and other things like this to try to kind of create better models, because there is so much we can't observe about a human brain itself. You need really sophisticated models that allow you to take both the neural and behavioral data you're measuring and make sense of them from a theoretical standpoint.
That was a great question. Thank you for asking
I
that.
have more, but I'll let you.
So let's go with, I'll just go in the order of who raised their hand first. So just.
That'd be me?
Yes, that's you.
What's funny, you're talking about empathy, and you had just talked about looking at a piece of choreography, and someone, especially if they have dance training, they're relating to that. And I once heard someone speak, I think his name was David Friedman or something. He was a Columbia scientist. Do you know this dude, David Friedman?
Yes, Friedberg.
Friedberg, exactly. And he was studying empathy neurons. And he talked about looking at a painting of someone throwing a javelin, and that they could brain image that the same things lit up as if you were, so the audience member for this painting was also lighting up that. Is that, so, and my memory of that was he was talking empathy neurons. So when you were just talking about the bodily whatever with the choreographer, was that also related to empathy neurons, or is this apples and oranges? I have no idea.
It's the same. But let me give you again. There's kind of like the neuroscience that makes it to kind of like pop neuroscience magazines, and then there's what those of us who are studying this kind of stuff kind of hear about. And so the fundamental finding years ago was what they were called mirror neurons, and they were discovered in monkeys. And the idea was that there's a neuron that responds when a monkey sees somebody pick something up, and that same neuron is involved when the monkey does it themselves. Now, since then, there have been there's some work that calls into question whether or not humans actually have single neurons that show this kind of mirror property. But even if that is not the case, even if there are not specific neurons that actually show engagement both in viewing and performing the same action, and as a side note, people got really excited about this at the time because they thought that this could be a neural basis for empathy and a neural basis for learning from imitation. Even if that's not true, it is the case that the brain definitely has what is now referred to as like an action observation network. There's a set of brain systems that are involved both in performing actions and in observing actions, and that one of the ways we understand actions is through kind of playing them through our head through the same systems that we might use to generate actions, even if it's not true that in humans there are single neurons that show these types of responses.
and then Dorothy, did you?
Well, I was thinking that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Sure.
When you're speaking about how people respond to art,
Oh, yeah.
because you absolutely bring whatever you manifest in yourself to what you're seeing.
Oh, definitely.
And then I was thinking about affinity groups. The extent that when you have a deeper knowledge of something, then it's like understanding production, or you look at it from, wow, like what 3D printer, like you parse it in a different level.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're emotionally reacting to it, but you're also kind of almost like scientifically looking, like how did they do that, and what's the scale, and what was that room like that they painted it, because all these things occur to you when you look at the thingness of the thing.
Oh, sure.
And then there's all the art history that kind of led to the person who, in that point of time, made that thing, that kind of led them to sort of have this breakthrough of their own creativity, but they're kind of standing on the shoulders of everything that's already ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these sort of simultaneity that kind of goes on all the time. But, it's like people that like Jackson Pollock, and other people think my kid could do that. So you have to assume that they're bringing, their own knowledge of the world to everything they do, and you can't really pierce that. You can only kind of work with that. And I guess that's what marketers do, right? They work with all these tropes in people to induce them to want things or decline, whatever. So I would think that your lab would be of great interest to kind of the more mercantile side of our society, because it's influencing people's behaviors and desires,
Yeah.
which is sort of the ultimate goal of most marketing, right? So anyway, I was thinking.
Yeah.
There's actually a book that I read called Biology, B-Y-E-Y-ology. And it was written by, I guess, scientists who use fMRIs to study consumer behavior. So there's a book on that.
Well, I believe most of marketing is based on, if someone else has it, it must be worth having. Right? Because that's what, right? Someone else has it, and so it must be worth having because someone else has it.
Yeah.
So I think there's aspiration and memory.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. All right, do either one of you want to comment on that first? I mean, I'm happy to talk about it.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll start then, I guess. I think in some ways, obviously to me, and hopefully after listening to you, it seems obvious that yes, we're bringing a lot of our past experience to bear, and that an experience and interpretation of art can't be anything but really person dependent. Like the term that I often use is interactionist, because it's not just solely about the piece, and it's not solely about the person, it's about the interaction of what a person is bringing to that piece. And however, there are lots of people in my field who really are focused on trying to come up with a predictive model just based on the stimulus. And I always kind of scratch my head and ask why, but I think we have to acknowledge that we have these experiences. So if you think about, how many people are really focused on the idea of like sacred geometry or something like that. Like we sometimes have these experiences that seem so compelling, that something out there in the world is kind of like just impacting us in this way, that it's so compelling we can't possibly think that somebody else wouldn't have the same experience. It really feels like it's out there in the world. And when we have an experience of beauty, we oftentimes have this feeling that we are actually understanding something deep about the world itself, which could actually be the case. And so I think that there is this fundamental tension between what it feels like to be moved and feel a sense of beauty of something in the world, and have this feeling that is so universal and so compelling, how could it not be? How could beauty not actually truly be in the world, and that I'm just perceiving it? Versus when you actually go into the lab and measure it, and you see that no, people are having dramatically different experiences, and my response to sacred geometry really depends upon my exposure. If I come from a culture that is more, Islamic, then I might have a very different response to certain types of sacred geometry than if I'm coming from a Christian culture, for example. Right. And so I think even at that basic level, when you actually go and measure, you find that people's different paths and people's different visual exposure is having a dramatic effect for sure. Yeah.
And just a question for you. What about something like sunsets that everyone seems to love?
Totally, yeah. This is a good question. So I didn't talk about it too much, but we do see that there's a much stronger degree of shared taste when people make evaluations of natural scenes, like a sunset or a mountain scene. But what I think is that, and I kind of represent a strong viewpoint within my field, I think that even when you do see agreement, like on something like that everybody generally finds a sunset to be beautiful, that still requires learning. And the reason that different people are gravitating towards a more similar evaluation is because there's something about the way we walk and operate through the world that is giving us feedback that pushes us towards more similar evaluations for things like faces or things like sunsets. And so the way that when we have to navigate through the world, and we live in a world where there are sunsets every day, then different people start to gravitate towards a similar cost function, a similar evaluation. But that same thing is not happening with art. There is no pressure that pushes everyone, unless you are an artist or you are an art critic or you are an architect, for example. You're not really evaluating a building, for example, in some consistent way that is going to push different people to have the same value function.
How are we on time?
We're about 15 minutes in the question.
Okay, so that's about all the time we have for questions. I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to Ed, Shae, and Paul for sharing their knowledge, insights, and experiences with us. I'd also like to thank Peep Space for hosting this discussion, and Shae Nadine, SubtleFlux, and her partner Clay for helping us to organize this talk and connecting us with Ed. We will now have a 1-hour gallery reception with light food and drinks, and would love those of you in the physical audience to join us. Thank you so much.